Just to start with, I think we had a nice session just before this, the technology session, because a lot of debate happened on that. I mean, if you see that, this session and the future technology, I don't think we will be able to cover in this, the 90 minutes or whatever it's there, because there's a vast subject. I think we will only do justice to some part of it, a bits of it, maybe 1/10 or 1/100th of it, and that's what I think. Another thing is, when looking at the technology, as someone mentioned, what is important is time to market is very important. And second is affordable, especially in a country like ours, it has to be affordable technology. And the third one is it should be a future-proof, because whatever investment you are going to make it has to be protected in the future. There are many issues. I mean, we have already heard about a lot of issues with respect to the power sector scenario today, and right from the generation till the distribution. And we only just had a last session on the last mile connectivity in the distribution side. But if you look at the generation side, today we have a challenge even with the generation as well. We don't have so much challenges with respect to transmission, but in terms of distribution, I think there's an enormous challenge which we are trying to address in this the forum. And though these the topics under the future technologies, we are trying to cover some part of a high voltage, some part of a millivoltage. I think we are not doing the justice for everything in this. But just to take you back into the technology side, since I have been in ABB for quite a long time, I would say that on the generation side, the technology per se is pretty matured. And the transmission, there are mature technology, but with the addition of the wide area monitoring, probably that is going to add on to the technology part of it. But on the distribution side, we have been discussing for the last 20 years, 25 years, that still the technology is in the stage to be finalized. And as mentioned in the previous session, it varies from the place to place where you are going to implement this technology. We have a challenge with respect to the time, because we are standing between your lunch. But nevertheless, we are going to have some session for the expert panelists here. And I've tried to see whether we can cover each presentation by around 6 to 8 minutes. And then follow with the panel discussions. I think probably that will be much more lively discussion just before the lunch. Yeah. So this is what we are. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So we have just discussed, because Terry has to leave, so he will start with the first presentation. Terry will take I think he can also discuss about more, because which we're going to cover in the next panel discussion as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I feel very honored to be part of this illustrious group here. I'm going to be talking about smart grid in a different way, the application of smart grid through the implementation of microgrids. So my talk is going to walk us through the concepts of why smart grid became prevalent and important, and then ultimately leading to the implementation plans for various aspects of smart grid. A little bit about our company. The introducer talked a little bit about our company. What we do is we're developers. We actually are different than a system integrator. We look at a number of different technologies to integrate into microgrid projects. Typically, you'd look at a microgrid as a very small utility where we're a generator, we're a distributor, and we are a retail provider. But our facet is that we also provide financing, and we can own and operate microgrids. We've got a couple of projects I'll be talking to you about a little bit later, particularly in East Africa. In my role as chair of the United Nations Work Group on Energy Access, it became apparent that building a big grid just didn't scale up fast enough to achieve the goals of limiting energy poverty by 2030. So a lot of the work that we're doing are in developing countries. So just to give a little bit of context onto why microgrids become prevalent, and I probably would take a little bit of an exception on the title of this program, Future Technologies. This is technologies today. These are technologies that we're actually building, but they came from a lot of work in thinking about how future technologies will be implemented. So as an integrator and a developer, we try to be technology neutral. As you can see on the slide, we have a number of different categories of the utility sector that we support. One of them that probably haven't been thought much about is broadband, and I'm really happy to follow the previous session. what we're going to do as we develop microgrids throughout different parts of the countries is we have to have communication infrastructure to support the smart grid, but because of that investment, we can also sectionalize part of that broadband, that communication infrastructure, and make it available to the public. So there's another added layer of value that we bring in as an implementer. So some of the key characteristics that we can provide are price stability, high reliability, energy efficiency, and energy security. And then also, as a lot of the regulators start to push towards renewable energy, we can start to integrate green production energy into it. So on the projects that we have today, we have a big array of different generation sources, but we try to focus strictly on the renewable sources. So if we go back in history, we'll see that as we start to think about the dilemma of eliminating energy poverty, we ask ourselves, can we base our future, our next 15 to 20 years of development on the history that we've had up to this point? And we see that much of the infrastructure is very, very old and antiquated and requires a lot of work. We find that it's very difficult to build large power plants or large transmission systems. There are so many policy issues and public issues that cause them to slow down. And for us to achieve energy access, we cannot really build upon that old paradigm. It's also became apparent that our distribution systems are radial, and so there's just a one-way power flow. But in the future, we have to be able to accommodate the fact that consumers are prosumers, they produce. And so if the utility wants to participate in a production capability from the consumer, they have to redesign their distribution circuits. If you take a look at the existing infrastructure, that's probably not viable. We have to look at a new paradigm. So as we look at really the case of the situation as business as usual, prices will continue to rise as fuel costs go up or as infrastructure costs continue to mount. Well, we've just come out of a very big recession worldwide, and we're not completely out of it yet. So how do we make those investments to still move forward for the consumption of energy that we plan? And we see that large power plants, large bulk power plants, are actually causing disturbances on the grid. So this clearly is a call towards the work that we're doing here in this forum, which is the application of smart grid. So smart grid is no longer just simply a theoretical or a conceptual idea. We are a practical implementer, and we can see the way in which to move forward. So we've already talked about the fact that regulators and legislators are pushing towards high renewable portfolio. This is one of the benefits of a smart grid in that we can start to manage power flow much more efficiently. We see that the rise of consumer-owned generation becomes part of the energy production mix. And yet, as we heard in many of the talks earlier today and yesterday, the utilities want access to customer information. They want to provide more services to the customer. That includes things like if the customer can produce energy, how do we meter them appropriately? There's a whole discussion around storage we're going to get into in some of the later discussions. But the point is that the smart grid simply integrates all of these technologies much more effectively than the large iron systems of the utilities of the past. So as we start to look for a shift in the way in which energy production will occur, if I'm right, and microgrids become prevalent, particularly in developing countries, we're going to see distributed resources as the primary opportunity. As you can see, there's a number of benefits that we can realize from this, but also there are quite a number of risks. That is that there are very few market players yet. And so in my role as chairman for the United Nations Foundation Work Group on Microgrids, I'm really working hard to convene all the players in the market to start thinking about how do they take their industrial-sized, large utility concepts and shrink them down and make them available on rural electrification plans. So the adoption process is still slow. We have a very difficult time showing that if we can build a solar rooftop, can we aggregate that solar rooftop with other solar rooftops and actually make a system? That's slow to develop, and so we're working on that. So this gets down to the point of how do we take all of these disparate technologies on the distributed renewable or distributed resource arena, and how do we integrate them, and how do we make them as a viable, cohesive organization? And that's where the concept of applying smart grid to the microgrid arena comes in. We take a look and we treat every asset in a distribution circuit, whether it's connected to the grid or whether it's not connected to the grid, treat them as entities that participate in the interaction of power flow. We have to have a tremendous amount of intelligence, telemetry, and control systems to manage each individual unit. We have to look at the various types of power systems that are being developed and power generation capacities. If they're renewable, we have to recognize that they're intermittent. And so we have to have strategies to either reduce load instantly, or we have to have some sort of storage capability. And it could be said that if microgrids are attached to the grid, we could even treat the grid as a battery. So we look at how do we take the advantages of the smart grid and apply it in the microgrid arena. I mentioned the fact that we need to recognize all the assets, but all those assets can be managed through a sophisticated control system that balances power. We want to be able to build off-grid, or we want to be able to be an extension of the grid. But quite frankly, I've worked with utilities over the last 5 to 6 years, and many of them don't see the microgrid concept really as viable for them. I spoke with the CEO for Eskom, which is a South African utility, and they tried the experiment for rural electrification using microgrids over the last 5 years, and they just couldn't make a business case. Well, it turns out they're still using, and I'm not accusing Eskom of this, but they're still using their old methods. They have a one-way power flow going out to the edge of the grid. And if they're going to have distributed resources that are committing resources back into the grid, how do they manage the upstream flow of power? And they just can't do it because of their antiquated systems. But this is an example of most utilities. They're still thinking in the days of build it big, build it as a one-way power flow, and we have to think differently. So these are the challenges that we see. Although that we're going to be introducing new power capabilities on the edge of the grid, we have to realize that sometimes if it's the utility that's participating in this, they have resources that we just can't eliminate. They have an investment that still has to be carried out. But also, we're going to be introducing unique capabilities at the edge of the grid that they've not had to deal with before. Most utilities provide voltage and VAR support and frequency regulation as just part of their normal domain working. But we're going to be able to, at the edge of the grid, provide those same services. A question one could ask is, well, if those are services that we have to provide for our own customer, which is the community or the village, why can't we offer those services to the grid as well? Well, we would offer it to the grid if there were a motive, if there was a financial motive to do that. And so what we need to do is work with the utilities to actually define a product called VAR support, as some of the transmission operators have today. If so, then we can start to arbitrate value back into the grid. Sharing information has come up in a number of conversations here, and this is one of the challenges that the utilities still have. They don't see that the customer-owned resource is an asset yet. And so we've talked even in the earlier conversation about the various communication protocols and prices to devices, and the devices having so many endpoints that it may overwhelm the utility. Nevertheless, that information is available, and it's really a responsibility of the utility to begin thinking of how to integrate that. Standardization becomes a very important part of that discussion. And of course, we also have to recognize that, and this talk that we had yesterday about security, as an element of smart grid, it has to be embedded even on a distributed owned resource such as a microgrid. So this is kind of a picture of the way in which we see a microgrid implemented. The projects that we have in Kenya right now are microgrids all across the country. The Parliament has asked us to work specifically on 10 towns and then put a map and a plan together for all the villages throughout the rural country. The 10 towns have already some generation capacity for backup. Also, they're connected to the grid. But our goal was to increase the reliability for each of those 10 towns so that we can either attract industry into those towns or prevent industry from leaving. This is one of the biggest challenges when you have a very fragile electrical infrastructure. Many countries in the developing world are witnessing many, many outages. And so the industrial sector has a really tough time maintaining a long-term business plan. In some cases, they decide to leave to find a country that has a more reliable grid. So we have to reverse that trend so that we can raise everybody's economy. So this is an example of where we integrate quite a number of different technologies into a single campus. But the real end goal is this picture here. The goal is that as campuses are built out, or as villages start to have their own microgrids designed, they start to integrate with one another. And we can have power flow that's managed between villages and between towns. It's the same way that the utility is looking at it now from a large bulk power delivery scheme moving out to the edge of the grid. But instead of reducing the size of the delivery system, making each delivery system autonomous, but eventually integrating them. So we're designing systems right now that can self-organize, and that some assets in one village may not be replicated in another village. Perhaps we put storage strategically somewhere between a number of villages, and then each of the villages has their own power generation, but they tap into a common resource. That same resource is available then to the grid as it starts to reach into where the rural communities have been developed. So if you're wondering, what is a developer versus an integrator, these are some of the challenges that we have as developers. Obviously, we think about how do we finance these projects, but how do we work with the local community to ensure that we can build jobs, but then improve reliability. We work with many, many different organizations, technology providers, and contractors. Basically, everything that you would envision occurring through a large utility, we do on a very small scale in the normal implementation plan. We also have found that in a number of countries that we've approached, that the regulation still doesn't make it possible for a private investor to come in and invest in our projects. So we still are completely dependent either on 100% subsidy or complete government ownership. For us to be able to grow the market quickly, particularly in the next 15 to 20 years, the Energy Access, the Sustainable Energy for All program under the UN is to eliminate energy poverty by 2030. We will not reach that goal if it's all subsidized. We need to bring in the private equity markets. And so to achieve that goal, we have to have regulatory reform, and a pretty uniform regulatory reform across all developing countries. So just to kind of close out my thoughts, there are a lot of economic and sociological change that will come about as a result of the implementation of rural electrification. We need to be part of that discussion, and we need to work with the regulatory bodies to help achieve a better understanding of energy access. But also, we're going to be implementing technologies that perhaps we own or perhaps we don't own. They have to be survivable, and we have to design them in a way that leverages all the good work that we've done in the smart grid community that advances this whole discussion about advanced technology and implementation in the power sector. It's my belief, and I've put my money on it, that we're going to be building microgrids all across the world. So we're going to see a growth in this market. I'm encouraging many, many participants from companies like ABB to Siemens to GE to also participate in developing these projects. There's a big market, and there's plenty of room for everybody. And one of the concepts I came up with and showed you was that I think that microgrids can coalesce and participate together. But there's two types of scaling up. There's a scale vertically, which is I need more power as I have an appetite for power, so I need to be able to design power systems that can grow in capacity. But I also have to be able to scale horizontally. So as my community grows in population, I can spread the microgrid design geographically. I see this as a new commercial growth opportunity, and we need more competition. But one of the challenges is how do we ensure that the technologies that we adopt are uniform? There's no standardization for microgrids. There are many standards for communication infrastructure, for telemetry, but in terms of the integration of all the pieces from the power generator to the SCADA systems to the distribution operations, all of those are unique niche markets, and we need to bring a community together that figures out how do we standardize so that a community that wants to buy a microgrid has confidence that the parts that they buy will interact with future parts that they buy. And that concludes my thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish that I could stay for Q&A. Unfortunately, I do have to catch a plane, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.